We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side.
That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Bob Moriarty, founder of 321 Gold and 321energy.com. He was also a Marine Corps fighter pilot in Vietnam. Bob, thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure talking to you again, Tom. It's always fun.
So, Bob, why don't we start with kind of a bigger theme here? You know, there's so many things that you have your finger on the pulse of in the world right now. What is, let's say, worrying you most or taking the most of your attention at this time?
That's a good question. And the idea of stepping back and looking at it from a global point of view, I think it's very important. I absolutely believe there is a gigantic conflict going on between the debt-based system of the West and a resource-based system of BRICS and the global South. Ukraine certainly played a part in that. NATO attacked Russia and lost that conflict. And so we've just kind of shoved it to the side. And now we've got a brand new conflict in Gaza and Israel. But overall, it is a conflict between the East and the West. And let me point something out to you. Let's define the attack in October 7th by Hamas. So let's call it terrorism. And let's define the number of Hamas terrorists as 25,000. Now, if you have a population of 2.3 million Palestinians, and 70% of them are Muslim, and somewhere between 10 and 30% are Christians, how do you get rid of 25,000 terrorists that are, you know, they don't wear uniforms, they don't have ID cards, there's no way to look at someone and know they're terrorists? How do you eliminate them? And the answer is you can't, because what caused them to be terrorists in the first place still exists. It's very real. It's very serious. The West has ignored it for 75 years. And there's a big question in my mind exactly what the purpose of this conflict is, because now it's becoming very aware that Israel was warned in advance and they knew that something was going to happen. And they either ignored it through incompetence or they ignored it deliberately. And you got Joe Biden, who's going to end up going to jail someday. And you've got Bibi Netanyahu, who's going to end up going to jail someday. And the question has to be, would they start World War III to postpone going to jail? And the answer is yes. Now, one thing that I could tell you is that if you define 25,000 Hamas terrorists as the enemy, you are not going to get rid of them with 4 aircraft carriers and a submarine. I was in combat. I selected weapons. I attacked targets. And you don't use aircraft carriers to carpet bomb Gaza. You use aircraft carriers to carpet bomb Iran or Syria or Lebanon. So the real question is, who's trying to do what in the Middle East? And it's pretty scary. You've got Iran, you've got Iraq, you've got Egypt, you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got Turkey, you've got Lebanon, you've got Israel, you've got the United States. What exactly is their intention? Here's what's scary. There are so many different players that little tiny minor players like Yemen can have an oversized impact. 17% of the world's energy goes through the Red Sea. And all they have to do is attack a few ships, and the insurance companies will cancel the insurance. And all of a sudden, you've got a totally different situation. I fear Israel, and I fear the United States. I think they have fallen into a trap. And they've done something that's so dangerous that it could be the end of both the United States and Israel. And that's a pretty serious thing to say. I don't know what the solution is. I don't think anybody knows what the solution is. Mm-hmm. But you've got Russia and China and the BRICS nations on one side, and you've got the EU, the United States, and Israel on the other side. And it wouldn't take much for it to go nuclear. That scares the shit out of me. I know just enough about war that nobody wins any war. My wife was English, okay, and we talk about World War II. We talk about the Allies winning the war. My wife was born in 1944, and until 1954, the UK was still on rations, okay? So we could say the British won the war, okay? But if you're on rations cost? 9 years after the war ends, what exactly did you win? So I fear the World War III greatly. And at the same time, we've got the financial chaos going on. And, you know, I'll be candid, the banking system has one foot on a banana peel and the other foot in the grave.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Bob. I'm thinking, as you're explaining that it comes back to incentives. You know, because of the amount of players in that area, I've seen some explanations, for example, that they want to make a new route around the Suez Canal as one explanation for some of the, let's say, the incentives that are driving these forces in there. So, you know, if we have all of these different international involvements in that area, do you think that is really the makings or the footstones for World War III?
Absolutely. You're talking about the Ben Gurion Canal, okay? And the Ben Gurion Canal would start in Gaza. And quite bluntly, my opinion, I'm not saying I'm correct. I'm just saying that's my opinion. My opinion is that Israel and the United States see this as the final solution for the Palestinian problem, and that is to either kill them all or to run them out of what was Palestine. If that, in fact, is their goal, I can tell you they're going to fail. But there's also a big gas and oil field off of Gaza that the Palestinians own or own part of, and Israel has literally stolen that. Mm-hmm. We've got some serious people making some serious mistakes, and it wouldn't take much for it to blow up. Some of the things, do you remember Wesley Clark when he went to the Pentagon right after 9/11?
I don't know.
Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments. And he said, I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Now, all of those countries are not countries that were the enemy of the United States. They never did anything to us. I mean, we know now that everything that we talked about when we invaded and destroyed Iraq, it was all a lie. Okay, we made it up. The weapons of mass destruction, they didn't exist. The Iranian nuclear program was started by the United States. It was peaceful. It is not a weapons program. We know that. We've known that for 25 years. Yet we still talk about Iran as being the enemy. Iran is not the enemy of the United States. However, Israel perceives those 7 countries as enemy. So Lebanon got attacked, Iraq got attacked, Iran is getting attacked, Somalia, Sudan, Libya. So we've destroyed these countries that are not enemies of the United States, and we created 37 million refugees. Now, the United States has yet to wake up to the fact that 9 million illegal refugees can be very dangerous. But they're starting to recognize it in Europe, and they're starting to react and say, look, we don't want all these refugees who have no intention whatsoever of living our lifestyle. We would like to be France. We would like to be Germany. We would like to be Belgium. We would like to be Sweden without all this constant conflict. So we're at a very dangerous time in world history. And again, going back to the financial system, what happens when the banks close? And the answer is it gets really chaotic then.
Bob, before we kind of move to the financial system, which obviously we're going to get to, do you think that there's merit in the cycles of war? And if so, are we entering a new cycle peak? You know, this 120 year war cycle that seems to come around just after the beginning of a new century?
I think there's a good possibility. I know that Martin Armstrong predicts things like that. That's not something that I know enough about to really, I can't give you any kind of a expert opinion. I'm so anti-war that frankly, I don't give a shit when they occur. I hate them all. But is there, well, the United States has been at war since its beginning every year except 15 years. The United States is the most militarized nation on earth in history, and that cannot end well. All empires collapse when they start getting involved in military adventurism, and some of them, like Afghanistan, was military adventurism. What exactly were we going to do that nobody in history has been able to do? The Afghans don't like people attacking them. And we had a bunch of goat herders kick the ass of the United States, and it cost us, I think, $2.3 trillion and 20 years for the United States to wake up and say, you know, we're not winning this war. So what did we do? We turned around and we started war with Russia. And Ukraine has been destroyed. And what did we do then? We turned around and started a war with Gaza. This is simple insanity, and it's not going to end well.
Bob, what is the danger to the West if, let's say, the Arab world cuts off the oil supply?
Well, think about, you just switched off the power.
I did?
No, I'm kidding. I'm saying if
I got you.
Arabs turn off, you just turned off the power. I'm actually surprised they haven't done that yet, because that would pull a plug on the world's financial system. The world's financial system is an accident just waiting to happen. What it's going to take to actually cause the collapse, I don't know. But Iran could do it all by itself. Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar, if they all sat down and said, okay, this is getting serious, why don't we just shut off fuel to the EU? It would be a cold winter.
Mm-hmm. So, Bob, turning to the financial system here, of course, you and I have spoken several times. Did you think the Fed would have been able to raise rates this far and keep them this high for this long?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, the answer is they could raise rates, but the problem is 0.5% interest rates to 5% interest rates in the fastest time frame of interest rate increases in history. It's destroyed the residential retail market. It's destroyed the commercial real estate market. Hedge funds are in deep, serious trouble. Insurance companies are in deep, serious trouble. The Americans certainly have not come to grips yet with the effects of paying 8% for a mortgage. Now, when I bought my first place, 8% looked like a great interest rate. But if you were paying 2% or 2.5% 2 years ago, it's a disaster. And the problem is, and you just kind of hit the nail on the head, the banks keep their reserves in bonds in the theory that bonds are safe and stable. And of course, when you increase the interest rates by 10%, you destroy the value of the bonds. The United States 30-year bond has decreased 53% in the last 2 years, and nobody prepared for that. These guys didn't hedge, even though interest rate hedges are 80% of derivatives. And so the banks literally went to the Fed and said, you got to do something to help us out. So the Fed came up with 2 different programs to paper it over, where the banks could transfer their losses to the Fed and then pay the money back over time. Well, they didn't change anything other than who's holding the hot potato. So it's now the Fed is holding a hot potato. And even though interest rates, 30-year bond has gone from 5% to 4.5% now, you would think the banks would start paying off the money, and they're not. They're going to these term loan things, and they're actually increasing their debt. Now, one thing that I say that I don't know anybody else that uses the term, all debts get paid. They get paid either by the borrower or they get paid by the lender, but all debts get paid. And there's this enormous amount, trillions and trillions of dollars in losses that the banks and the Feds are pretending it's not a problem. Well, it is a problem, and it's going to blow up one of these days. Now, there's a website that I go to, and I cannot say that this is absolutely correct, but I've seen information that UBS Bank in Switzerland is not paying depositors, not giving depositors their money back and saying, come back in 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. Now, I've seen this before. I had a wire transfer last week that normally takes 2 hours, and it took 5 days. And I had to write my bank and say, hey, guys, this we've done this wire transfer 20 or 30 times in the past. How can it go from 2 hours to 5 days? And I think that every bank is sitting on cash now. Did you catch the shadow bank in China that just said they have no cash? Did you pick up on that?
No, I haven't seen that.
The Chinese banking system is a disaster waiting to happen, and there are $3 or $4 trillion in loans. And one of the minor players in the Chinese shadow banking system just said, "We have no money." I think there's a liquidity crisis going on right now. That's just my opinion. But I think there's a liquidity crisis, and something is going to cause it to blow up. I'm not sure what that is.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that it's this duration mismatch? Is it a lack of reserves? Can you point to any particular problem within the system that you think is part of that ticking time bomb?
Well, if you go back to the Signature Bank, okay. Again, derivatives. Everybody in our sector thinks of derivatives as gold and silver, and strange enough, gold and silver derivatives are a very tiny fraction of 1%. Most derivatives are interest rate have to do with interest rates, either short-term interest rates or long-term interest rates, either fixed interest rates or variable interest rates. Signature Bank did nothing to hedge the potential losses. Now, if you lower interest rates to 0.5%, it's very predictable, especially when you've got 6 or 8% inflation, that sooner or later you're going to have to increase interest rates. And these banks did nothing to hedge their potential risk. And they destroyed themselves in the process. But when 80% of derivatives is interest rate based, okay, when interest rates change that much, someone is losing a lot of money. And at some point in time, you have to mark to market. We haven't done that yet.
Mm-hmm. So, Bob, this obviously brings to mind the idea that there is a real need for hard assets that one wants to be able to kind of, as you say, hedge these risks right now. So obviously you and I look at gold quite a bit. What is one of your favorite contrarian indicators for gold?
I'm glad you said that. If I was 30, I would subscribe to Jake Bernstein's daily sentiment indicator. And it's not cheap, but he puts it on sale a couple times a year. And I could take $100,000 and turn it into $1 million in a year or two. The daily sentiment indicator is the single best measure of sentiment that I've ever seen. And it marks tops and it marks bottoms, and that's true of, I think, 22 different commodities. I'm a contrarian. When I went through college, one of the 4 colleges that I went to at Southern Methodist, and they actually had some really great core requirements, and we were required to read and report on extraordinary popular delusions in the madness crowds. And that's a book that was written around 1850. And there's about 30 stories of how stupid people have been historically in the South Sea bubble, in the tulip bulb craze. There's just been one craze after another, and eventually, after you've read all of these 30 stories, you realize, people are really stupid. So if you can measure what people do accurately, you can make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. I happen to think that we're in a rally right now, and we've been in a rally for a month of gold shares compared to gold. And if you look at the XAU or the HUI over gold, you can see a very clear chart pattern. There's a lot of things that I don't try to do. I don't try to predict price because I'm not smart enough to do that. There's a lot of people who think they are. But if I can measure sentiment, I'm always going to do the opposite of what the crowd is doing, because ultimately the crowd is always wrong. Now, I don't look at gold as money, and people always get upset when I say that. My view is gold is an insurance policy against financial chaos. And when you're in an environment that we're in right now, I think that having reserves that you know are safe is very important. And I think the people who have reserves in gold or silver are going to be rewarded handsomely.
I had a guest on, I think it was last week or the week before, Rudy Havenstein, and the way he puts it is that gold is like a handgun that you keep in your drawer that you never want to use, kind of thing.
That's a really good way of putting it. But to give you a comparison, of course, the high in inflation in Germany was 1922 and 1923, and a US $5 gold piece or a British sovereign, which both have about a quarter of an ounce of gold in them, you could buy a nice apartment in Berlin for that. We're going to see a lot of paper assets go to paper asset heaven, and we're going to see people who have real assets get substantial value from that. So I'm quite happy owning gold and silver. I'm not saying that there's a group within the gold and silver community who want to worship gold and silver, and it's not something that I think you should worship. But if you go back through history, of course, the French involvement in the U.S. Revolutionary War led to the bankruptcy of the French king. And 1789, the revolution started. And then by 1795, 1796, a French colonel named Napoleon took over. And there were a lot of people who opposed him. So he simply went out and shot them, okay, because it got pretty brutal. The revolution started with 35,000 of the elite, okay, the royalty, and it ended with 3,500. The rest of them either had their heads chopped off or they left the country. But when Napoleon took over, he went back to gold and silver because it is the fastest way to restore an economy, because it's a real economy as opposed to a paper economy.
Mm-hmm. Bob, as we're talking about, let's say, the movement of crowds or the sentiment of crowds, is there also a seasonality to the gold price and mining stocks that you play or that you've observed over the years?
Yeah, of course. And we track that. And people can go to my website and we show charts, and we just happen to be in the most favorable period of the year.
Well, I don't think necessarily that we're only just in the most favorable period of the year, but there are a couple other factors that are really adding to this time as well, being above that $2,000 US an ounce. And if we get a breakout above that, let's say 2080 level, that's another real momentum push for the gold price and interest in the mining stocks, is it not?
Well, John Rubino happens to be one of the smartest guys in the industry and a brilliant speaker, which makes me just hate him. And frankly, he predicted, I think the high in gold was 2062. He said when it breaks 2062, people will wake up to the extraordinary value in gold shares. There are so many deals in gold shares right now compared to commodities, compared to the S&P, compared to the Dow, and even compared to gold. There's some extraordinary opportunities. Of course, people don't want to hear that. Oh my God, I'm going to have my gold stocks have gone down and I hate everybody in the industry. Well, get over it. Okay. Stocks go up and stocks go down, and they went up until March and they've gone down since March, and it's time for them to go up again. So it's an extraordinary opportunity, but you have to learn to think. John Rubino did a really great article, and we posted on the website about all it would take to ignite gold stocks is passing the 2062, and we're only 2.5% below that. We could do that, and we could do that this week. Okay, and I think we're going to.
So, if or when we get this financial system crash, Bob, does this really create a scenario where it will be a disastrous investing landscape for the assets that have benefited so much from the decades of falling interest rates?
Absolutely. I mean, you just nailed it. You just defined it. The assets that went up the most because of declining interest rates are the ones who go down the most as interest rates increase. And frankly, and that's just my opinion, absolutely don't invest on this. I think interest rates are too low. And I think they're not only going to go higher, I think they're going to go much higher.
Through what type of mechanism? The Fed or the markets driving them there?
The markets. The Fed doesn't have anywhere near the impact that people like to believe. People like to believe that some guy's sitting at a keyboard at the Fed and he pushes a button and that moves 30 years. It's not the way it works, okay? The markets are far more important than anybody wants to admit. The Fed can affect short-term rates, but it can't affect long-term rates.
Mm-hmm. So when we put all of this together, Bob, does that just kind of strengthen the argument for investing in mining stocks because of a rotation of capital from, let's say, these non-productive assets into underinvested sectors of the mining and the energy sector?
Well, you started the question very good. You always want to invest in what is hated the most. Now, frankly, it doesn't make any difference what it's hated. When people come back and start hating real estate, that will be a good time to invest in real estate. When people start hating Rolex watches, that would be a good time to invest in Rolex watches. You should do exactly the opposite of what the crowd is doing. Now, everybody that I know recognizes what a disaster gold stocks have been over the last year. And they're stocks, I wrote about a stock yesterday, and the stock was twice as high 2 months ago. Nothing has changed whatsoever, but it's lost 50% of its value. That's staggering. But I think it's temporary. I think it's a liquidity issue. And when it turns, it's going to turn violently and hopefully profitably.
You know, as you're explaining that, it makes me think, did it lose 50% of its value or 50% of its price?
Well, that's a very, very good point. I make the argument that if you walk into your Jaguar dealer, okay, and he's got your dream Jaguar for $50,000, and you come back a week later and he said, hey, look, we've got this get out of Dodge sale and you can have it for $25,000. Would you look at that as a bad deal? Now, quite bluntly, other than the fact that I hate Jaguars, okay, I would look at that as a good deal. But with gold stocks, oh my God, my gold stock has gone down 50%. I want to commit suicide. No. Okay. If it was a good deal 2 months ago and nothing has changed except the price, it's a better deal now. I just see, and people like to ask me, okay, give us 5 or 10 stocks. I can't do that. I can't do that because there are hundreds of extraordinary value stocks right now. And at some point in time, you have to go out and start throwing darts.
Mm-hmm. So, Bob, as we're talking about, let's say, what's hated or what is out of favor, do you think that plays into the energy side of things, especially the oil and gas side that, really has been turned away from, as some people say, way too prematurely, before we really have a lot of the replacement energy that is being lauded about so much, before that's available and easily transferable to?
That was a little convoluted, Tom.
That's fair. It's
okay.
I'm doing it off the top of my head
a lot, but that was really convoluted. Here's what I think. The renewables are fraud. Climate change is fraud. Electric vehicles are fraud. Okay. And the elite, okay, who want a one world government, have forced people into believing all this stuff that it's absolute rubbish. And one is you could kill fossil fuel and you can replace it with wind turbines. Here's how that works. If you take the total cost of a wind turbine, from buying the land, building the concrete pad, putting the thing up, putting the generator, buying the wings, to when it wears out and you demolish it, it never pays for the total cost. Okay, it's fraud. Nobody makes money on these things unless there's government subsidies, and you've got governments catering to the mob, and they're saying, okay, the solution is green energy. Well, electric vehicles are not green, period. Okay, the cost of energy to drive a mile in an electric vehicle is $17, okay, compared to $3 for a gallon of gasoline. Electric vehicles don't work economically. Wind turbines don't work economically. Solar puts literally the control of our electric grid in the hands of the Chinese. Okay, and it's not particularly efficient. We need to use rational nuclear energy and figure out a way to do it safely. And I think you can do that if you can do it with these tiny power systems. And we need to use the diesel and gasoline and natural gas. Natural gas is the cleanest form of energy, period. Okay, but governments are always looking to create problems to make people vote for them. And they're lying about everything. They lied everything about COVID. Every single thing they said was a lie. Everything that they've said about Ukraine is a lie. It's been a lie from the very beginning. This isn't a war Russia started. It's a war that the United States and NATO started. Why did the United States lie about moving NATO to the east? Why did Ukraine lie about Minsk II? Why did Germany and France participate in those lies? And then they turn around and say, oh, the nasty Russians, that nasty old Putin started the war. He didn't start the war. Even with this thing in Gaza, the accepted figure now is 1,200 Israelis or 1,200 Jews were killed by Hamas. What they haven't said, and the Israeli government knows, is that a substantial number of those 1,200 people were actually murdered by the IDF, okay? I have seen videos of attack helicopters shooting at everything that moved. Now, how do you tell the difference between a Hamas terrorist and a civilian from a helicopter? And the answer is you can't possibly do it. I was a forward air controller in Vietnam. If I had seen somebody that I was controlling behave so out of control, I would have had them court-martialed. Okay. Now, Israel has this doctrine called the Hannibal Directive. And that is, rather than have Israelis captured, the IDF will deliberately try to kill them. So the IDF killed many, perhaps even most of those 1,200. When you look at it in those terms, you realize everything you're being told about this war is a lie. Now, it is absolutely legal for people in a concentration camp that is controlled by a different government to try to break out. Hamas wasn't trying to kill Israelis. Hamas was trying to capture them and use them as hostages because Israel is holding 9,000 hostages, 80% of which have never been charged with any crime. Okay. And they're holding them in Israeli prison. We need to start looking at both sides of every story. If Israel has the right to self-defense, which I agree with, doesn't Gaza have that same right? We need to start being honest, and the best way to start being honest would be to fix the financial system, which is totally corrupt.
And unfortunately, I think is unfixable without a lot of pain.
But strange enough, we're going to go through that pain, and that's just as predictable as lowering interest rates to near zero. Okay, you have pulled the pin on a hand grenade. It doesn't make any difference when you release the spoon. When you've pulled the pin, you know the hand grenade is going to go off. Our financial system is broken. We need adult leadership. We need a better solution. And it's not having the Fed put out a bunch of paper. We had, a month ago, we had a $600 billion increase in the U.S. debt in 1 month. Now, tell me that's sustainable.
I won't be the one to tell you that, Bob. So, as we've discussed all of these negative things in the world, is there anything right now that gives you hope that you're feeling positive about, Bob?
Let me give you an example. You're in Miami, right on the coast, and there's a Category 10 hurricane approaching. What do you know about the day after the hurricane hits?
Going to be chaos?
No, that's when it hits. Okay. The strange thing is, after it's hit, you could start rebuilding. Okay. Here's what's crazy, and nobody ever discusses that, and that makes your question a really good question. My God, the world has been through this probably 3,000, 4,000 times. There's nothing new about what's going on. My problem with the oligarchs is they are categorically stupid people. Okay. They have confused having dollars with having cents. Okay. And it's absolutely not true. You look at guys like Bill Gates and Soros and Steve Jobs. Much of the money that they made, I won't take anything away from them. They're great businessmen, very smart people. They just happen to be in the right place at the right time. Okay. But having a lot of money and having a lot of power doesn't make you smarter than everybody else. It just makes you think you're smarter than everybody else. Every history book is filled with stories of the stupidity of the idiots running government. I happen to subscribe to the belief that our forefathers had: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Samuel Adams. These guys believe the best government is the least government. I don't see one world government as some kind of solution. I see a one world government as a total absolute disaster run by a bunch of boneheads who have screwed up everything they've ever touched. So we're going to make it through. We always make it through. And the beauty is that the real leaders tend to float to the surface. Every war starts with the dumbest generals imaginable, and by the end of the war, you've learned to fire the idiots and hopefully find a U.S. grant.
Excellent. Well, Bob, I think on that note, we should wrap up unless there's anything else you'd like to touch on. I
don't think so. We are in a precarious time, but the good news is, in 1928 and 1929, access to information was severely limited. We don't have that situation. The average person has more access to information, and good information, than they've ever had in history. And that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. But you've got to learn to evaluate the information, and you've got to learn, if guys are lying to you all the time, you don't have to believe them.
Absolutely. I think that has never been tougher, though, to really find a source that you're able to trust. And to your point, I think having the ability to evaluate information, kind of understanding how to think rather than what to think, is a lot more valuable in that situation.
That you just hit the nail on the head. That's exactly right.
Well, Bob, on that note, we can send people to your website if they want to read more of your articles and a collection of great gold and energy articles, news as well, both available 321gold.com and 321energy.com, right?
And if they're interested in some good reading, I'm not the best writer that's ever existed. I'm a good writer, but not the greatest writer ever existed. But the range of things that I've written is pretty much wider than most of the authors that I personally follow. So if you go to Amazon and put in Robert Moriarty, I've got some good books that will help people. And I've deliberately made them just as cheap as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a massive range of topics that you've covered there.
Correct.
Excellent. Thanks so much for your time today, Bob.
Okay, Tom. It's always fun. Thank you.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.